Hi, I'm Anna Mercer and I'm from Keats House Museum in Hampstead. I've been visiting the Wordsworth Trust this week where I've had the chance to talk to their fabulous staff to gain some ideas that will go into the production of our next project at Keats House, which is called Keats 200. And in this project we'll be celebrating the bicentenary of Keats arriving to live at the house in Hampstead, and also several other great anniversaries, including the construction of his odes in 1819. So in the Wordsworth collection, which is what I've been looking at today with the help of the assistant curator, Poppy Garrett, we've looked at this first edition of Keats' Endymion. We've also looked at several other amazing treasures in the collection, including Wordsworth's Prelude, Dorothy Wordsworth's Grasmere Journal, and some first editions by the Shelleys, including Frankenstein. So today what we've been looking at is this first edition of Endymion, which we marked the bicentenary of the publication of earlier this year. So Endymion was the poem that appeared in 1818. This is a particularly interesting edition of Endymion, not only because it's the first edition, but within it we found that someone has inserted a image of Keats within the pages that we don't think could be parts of the original publication, because it looks very much like an image eulogising Keats, and it's also printed on different paper. Okay, so here we can see the title page, which says 1818, so we know this is from the first editions of this poem. On the other side, this is what I was talking about earlier, this presentation of an image of Keats is what we think is quite unusual. We can see it's a different type of paper that's been inserted to the text, and it has this kind of very ornate image of Keats on it. Quite an unusual portrayal of Keats too, in my opinion, with very long, dark, flowing hair, which seems quite striking to me, as he's usually pictured with much shorter, blonder hair. And also this picture very much looks like a commemorative picture. It kind of appears within what looks like a commemorative wreath. It looks like it might be the kind of thing placed into the book after Keats's death, which obviously was only 3 years after Endymion was published, so it could have been quite soon after, or it could have been put in by a later owner when Keats began to be more venerated by later generations. If we continue to turn through the book, we can take ourselves to the first page of Endymion, one of Keats's perhaps less favoured poems, definitely less favoured during his lifetime, but obviously now appreciated in lots of ways. But besides its kind of complicated critical history, it is very well known and celebrated always as starting with that line, "A thing of beauty is a joy forever. Its loveliness increases, it will never pass into nothingness," which I'm sure anyone could agree is beautiful. At Keats House, we also have some first editions of Endymion, one of which it's interesting to compare here, because our first edition has a sketch by Joseph Severn of a lyre on this front page. So it's interesting to see just the plain page compared to our kind of etching that we've got in Keats House. Okay, so here I'm looking at an edition of Keats's letters, which is beautiful. Poppy and I were just discussing how nice it might be to kind of think about what Keats did when he was here in the Lake District. So Keats visited the Lake District in 1818, just ahead of his walking tour of Scotland with Charles Brown. And he did try and visit Wordsworth in Rydal Mount, but he didn't find anyone at home. So there's just a little passage in here which is quite nice, where he talks about Grasmere. He says, "Wordsworth's house is situated just on the rise of the foot of Mount Rydal. His parlour window looks directly down Windermere. I do not think I told you how fine the vale of Grasmere is, and how I discovered the ancient woman seated on Helm Crag." After that, we can see he also heads up to Carlisle, and it was during this visit to the Lake District in 1818 that Keats also climbed Skiddaw, and we have a really nice account in his letters of him climbing Skiddaw too, and I think he has some brandy or some whiskey to keep him going all the way to the top. So this is a particularly exciting first edition that I've got to view today in the Wordsworth Trust collection for me. This is a first edition of Percy Bysshe Shelley's Epipsychidion. This was published in 1821 and published anonymously in London from Italy, when Shelley was obviously living in Italy at this time. I've never seen a first edition of Epipsychidion before, so I was very, very excited to actually hold one and see one. Obviously, I think this is quite rare because there are only a certain amount printed anonymously before Shelley started to distance himself from the poem after its first appearance. A poem with a really interesting critical history. It was described first of all by Shelley as an idealised history of my life and feelings, but as I've mentioned, he did kind of distance himself from some of the supposed confessions he makes within this semi-autobiographical poem. It's particularly interesting for me because I work on the Shelley's collaboration, so that's Mary Shelley's collaboration with Percy Bysshe Shelley. For example, Mary Shelley's editing of Percy Shelley's works is a particularly interesting story to think about when you look at Epipsychidion. This was the only poem of Percy Bysshe Shelley's that she refused to write a note for in her publications of his poetical works after his death. His only long poem anyway, because obviously she only wrote notes for the substantial works. And there's been quite a lot of discourse about this, about Mary's supposed hurt she felt by this poem as it is addressed to another woman. So particularly exciting to see this copy of Percy's Epipsychidion, and I really thank the Wordsworth Trust for letting me look at this today. Okay, so this is another beautiful thing we've looked at today in the Wordsworth Trust collection. This is a first edition of Percy Bysshe Shelley's Adonais, obviously an elegy on the death of John Keats that appeared in 1821, just not long before Shelley's own death in 1822. I wanted to draw attention to this because I mentioned at the start that we are working on a project called Keats 200. Keats 200 will run from December 1818, 2018, to all the way to 2021. And then it will, in the middle of that, it will also become Keats Shelley 200, because we're working with the Keats Shelley House in Rome, the Keats Shelley Association of America, and the Keats Shelley Memorial Association to celebrate not just Keats,